You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Hello, friend, and welcome to episode 167 of the Business for Good podcast. It was great to hear from several of you about the last episode that we did on Eon with their CEO, Anna Pavlovich. She is, again, the self-described crazy rock lady who's grinding up olivine and spreading it all over agricultural fields to try to sequester carbon. It's a pretty cool idea, and I appreciate all the feedback on the episode. If you want to message me anytime, I always love hearing from you, so you can just go to businessforgoodpodcast.com and write me a message there. Look forward to hearing from you. Let me know if you have any suggestions on ways that you think the show could be better, things you like, things you don't like, anything that's on your mind. Now, on to this episode. This guest is someone who has spent her career studying and championing entrepreneurs who don't always fit the Silicon Valley mold. Dr. Lori Rosenkopf is the Vice Dean of Entrepreneurship at the Wharton School and the author of the new book, Unstoppable Entrepreneurs: 7 Paths for Unleashing Successful Startups and Creating Value Through Innovation. In this short guide, Lori explores how success doesn't have to mean dropping out of college to start a venture-backed unicorn in your garage. Instead, she highlights 7 distinct paths that entrepreneurs can take to build an impactful venture, whether they're bootstrapped, mission-driven, or even working within larger companies. Drawing on her years of research and mentoring at one of the world's top business schools, Lori introduces what she calls the 6 R's of entrepreneurial mindset. I don't know how you remember a list of 6 of anything, but those 6 R's are reason, relationships, resilience, resources, results, and recombination. She'll talk about that in the interview about what all those mean, but these are what she says are the core principles that help explain why some founders succeed while others falter. In this conversation, we talk about the entrepreneurs Lori profiled in her book, from disruptors and acquirers to accidental founders, and what their stories can teach us about resilience and innovation. If you've ever thought, I am just not the typical entrepreneur, perhaps Lori will convince you that maybe there is no such thing. I'll let her try to convince you. Lori, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
Okay, so you've had an illustrious career so far, but I'd love to know, why did you write this? You talk about unstoppable entrepreneurs, which I thought was a good title, since most entrepreneurs do get stopped, right? Most of them, as you point out, fail. But there are some unstoppable entrepreneurs. And why did you write this book? I want to get into what the book is saying, but what was your motivation in the first part for writing it?
I wrote the book because role models matter. And at Penn, I'm responsible for our Student Center for Entrepreneurship. So I work with students of all sorts of interests and alumni in all sorts of industries. And the role models that we're seeing in the media are essentially of one type, right? The college dropout, a venture-backed founder who builds a unicorn. And that's not the best role model for many people who are doing incredibly important things. So I wrote the book to lay out a set of people who would be inspirational across different paths and also across different demographic interests and industries.
Yeah, it definitely is a case that it's almost like now a badge of honor to say you're a college dropout, right? Like you were too good for college and that you're going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. But you make the argument that that's, the college dropout who's Silicon Valley backed is not the only type of entrepreneur out there. And you discuss and profile others who you think will make perhaps at least different, if not better, role models. And so what do you think? Like, what makes a better role model for you than the type of person you just described?
Yeah, and I'd even go further than saying there are different types. These college dropout sorts of folks who are held up in the media, they're actually really quite rare. These unicorn tech bro founders that are getting much of the celebrity entrepreneur attention. This is not the norm. The average founder is actually, for the top venture-backed companies, is average age 30, late 30s, early 40s. So these are the anomalies, but they've gotten outsized attention because they have created gigantic tech companies in most cases that have had outsized influence.
Indeed. And, I interestingly, if you read the book Super Founders, the assertion is that there is not a particular age of a most successful founder, that you have successful founders who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and it's not skewed to one of them. It's not like, that you have a skew, that it's more of a personality type rather than an age or whether they're college dropout. But, it's not surprising that you, working as a dean as you do at a prestigious institution, would think that people should not drop out from school. But tell us what they should do. So what are the type of people who you think will succeed as entrepreneurs?
Well, in the book, I profile 7 different paths, and one of them is the disruptor, which is closest to the stereotype we've been talking about. But the person I've chosen as my exemplar, she's not a tech pro, but I focus on a bunch of different pathways where in any case, people are interested in creating value by innovating, and it winds up turning into some sort of a larger endeavor. I don't want to say their own venture, because sometimes they're the entrepreneur that's working inside a company and is building out a new business. Or they might be an acquirer who says, I am going to find a way to purchase a small mom and pop shop, maybe several of them, and start to scale them and build them up. Many of the examples that I have are people who are bootstrapping their organization, so they're not looking for venture funding. And of course, the social entrepreneur is a key pathway as well, because I don't think that gets as much attention as it deserves.
Yeah. So you talk about these 7 paths, and you also talk about these 6 characteristics, right? You're talking about what you call the 6 R's. So I'm going to enumerate them for you. That, you talk about reason, relationships, resilience, resources, results, and recombination. But in other interviews, when asked what the most important characteristic for a successful entrepreneur is, you talk about resilience. And you think that's the key one here of these 6. So first, why resilience? Why is that more important, let's say, than reason or relationships or resources and so on?
Well, I call the book Unstoppable Entrepreneurs, right? That sounds sexier than resilient entrepreneurs. But to a person, everyone I interviewed for the book, not just the 7 key subjects, but there are many examples that give variety within each of the paths. To a person, when you get them talking, they tell you about all the challenges that they faced along the way. And some of those challenges are very much inherent in you have an idea, and at first it's not well formed enough to really meet markets where they are really willing to show some demand. So you get lots of negative feedback and have to respond to that. But lots of the challenges that my entrepreneurs faced were also out of their control. COVID happens and you're running bus tours for young women to learn about careers. You have to be able to pivot and become virtual and turn yourself into an ed tech, which is, of course, one of the great stories in my book, Caitlin Grasso and her company, Generation. Now look what's going on with the economic uncertainty. People have to be able to respond and react to that. So I think that quality is something that unifies across all different types of entrepreneurs. Anyone who's trying to innovate and create value, you're going to have lots of setbacks. But frequently the stories we hear in the media tend to sanitize that part of it. They're telling the great success and the hockey stick sort of progress instead.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about reading the book Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, was that, which is, of course, is like really iconic in this space now, but to the outsider, you just see Nike as this huge success, but he talks about the numerous near-death experiences that the company had and the ways that he was basically like cheating and stealing to keep the company alive. Like he was really unbelievable, even talking about he would tell the bank he needed a loan for one purpose because he knew they wouldn't leave him the loan for the purpose he really wanted it for. And all these ways that, he did what he had to do in order to keep his company alive before they became successful. And and I feel like, often when you hear about success stories with companies, it is, even if not hockey stick, as you pointed out, that it's a path to success as opposed to lots of near death. In your experience with the companies, even the ones that you profile in the book, and I want to get into those, are near-death experiences, you think, the norm for startups, or do you think that is something that some of the more successful ones have not had?
Most companies have existential crises as they're getting started because it's just really incredibly difficult to be able to come up with an idea that is immediately met with great response from the market, where everyone is desperate from your product. So almost every company that I get to talk to has pivoted from their original idea. And just to go back to this issue of what it is about these stories and the resilience, whenever I do panels, which is very frequently in my role, we'll bring back several entrepreneurs at any reunion event and the like, and I'll get to moderate a panel. And I always find that the audiences really stand up and take notice when people are talking about the biggest challenges and the struggles that they had, because that's where the inspiration for anyone else to get started or keep going really comes from.
Nice. Okay, so let's talk about some of these folks who you're profiling in the book. You mentioned one, but give us a story of somebody who you view as what you would call a non-traditional founder, or at least not stereotypical founder, I guess would maybe be a better way to put it, and what they did to succeed. So let me give you the chance to tell any one of the stories that you've told in the book that you think may be the best one to tell.
Okay. I think I'll talk about Joan Lau. And Joan is my representative of the technology commercializer. And Joan calls herself an accidental entrepreneur. She's now CEO of a company that's working to cure cystic fibrosis. So a life-changing sort of product, but that takes many years to develop. But Joan was trained as a neuroscientist and worked at a large pharmaceutical firm for a bunch of years. And while she knew that this was helpful to people, she would say things like, I spent a lot of time in big meetings deciding whether the pills should come in 2 packs or 4 packs. And so she got the urge to find a way to have more impact. And at some point joined a friend's startup and worked in that startup, and then got the bug for these small companies. And she wound up not only working and becoming CEO of one small biotech, but then wound up partnering with another person to invest in these sorts of companies. And now, as I said, she's the CEO of a company called Spirovant, working to cure cystic fibrosis. And so that's she isn't someone who woke up as a youngster saying, I want to be an entrepreneur. But now if you talk to her, she says, I understood at some point that I was not retaining enough of the value I was creating when I was working in this corporation. I wanted to go out on my own and be able to accrue the value for what I can do. So she's just an incredible person with a very inspirational story.
All right. So which one of these paths does Joan embody, do you think? So like if you think about the seven paths that come out.
Yeah, she's the technology commercializer because she didn't invent this cure for cystic fibrosis, but instead she's scouting the different patents and technologies that are being developed, typically out of universities or adjacent to universities, and looking for strong candidates that then she can apply a commercialization lens to.
All right, cool. So, technology commercializer is one of them, but how should, let's say there's somebody right now, Lori, who's thinking, they want to start their own company, maybe like, how should an aspiring entrepreneur assess which of your 7 paths might be right for him or her, right? Is it more about personality, circumstance, mission? Like, what would you say is the way for somebody saying, I want to start a company? I've just read Lori's book. I really liked it, but I don't know which one of these I am. Which one do I fit into?
And I would say you don't have to be just one, because many of the people, I think we could argue that Joan is a technology commercializer, but she also has a strong social component to her mission because she is trying to cure a disease that currently has no cure. And many of the subjects in my book will also do one path and then go into others. I'll give you those examples later. But I think anyone, whatever stage they're at, well, 2 of my R's are really relevant here. One, reason. About half of the entrepreneurs in my book have a burning passion. for something, right? So Caitlin wanted to help young girls find great careers and be empowered and the like. Jared, who is the founder of Harlem Capital, he is African American and looked at the field of private equity and investing and said there's too much being left on the table because minority entrepreneurs aren't being funded. I want to find a way to build up a bigger community of these entrepreneurs. And he founded Harlem Capital with that in mind. So lots of the entrepreneurs have this underlying purpose and reason that leads them eventually to found the firm. But the other half, these are the folks that say, oh, you know what? When I was in middle school, I got suspended for selling Halloween candy because the principal didn't want me making a profit on my Halloween candy. I got in trouble for doing that. Or they'll talk about I was the best paper boy in the neighborhood. So they'll tell these stories, say, I just knew I was entrepreneurial. I wanted to work for myself and I had to find and figure out a place. So either of those could be true for people. So I encourage people to look back, what are the things that you've been passionate about, the experiences that you've had that lead you to see particular problems that are in need of solutions. So that's certainly one piece of it. The other R that matters is recombination. And this is kind of a technical term. I use it in my own research, but the idea here is that most innovation comes from people mixing and matching disparate things and finding ways to have a unique insight because of their own experiences. Like a good example, not even from the book. I've been struggling with sinus and allergy issues. It's that time of year. And if you grow up in India, you've been using a neti pot your whole life in order to keep your sinuses clean. And if you move to America at some point, you say, why are people spraying all these chemicals in their nose? And indeed, then because of the mix of your cultural experiences and then being in a new geography, you say we could create an Americanized version of the neti pot and be an entrepreneur in that sort of way. So that's the idea of recombination. So I really like to encourage people to say, what have you done that's unique? What is it about you that gives you a different insight? Is it because you've lived in multiple different countries? Is it because you've had a variety of experiences across different industries? Is it because you took a unique course of study when you were in school, or you're doing an interesting hobby now? Whatever those things are, the thinking about the mixing and matching starts to give people insights into the sorts of projects they might pursue and therefore the paths that they might follow.
Nice. So I do want to talk about some of those ideas that you're mentioning, especially ideas that you think are underserved right now for where some entrepreneur might be able to make a difference. But before we get into those ideas, Lori, you feature multiple entrepreneurs in the book, which I really enjoyed, who created value without raising any VC funding, right? Like so often you think of the job of a founder as raising capital, right? Like so many of these founders, it almost reminds me of like members of Congress who are just always dialing for dollars. But like you have these founders and they're spending a huge portion of their time just trying to raise capital from investors. Whereas, you talk about folks who are bootstrapping and are basically, instead of trying to sell shares in their company, they're trying to sell their product to customers, right?
Right.
And so let me ask you about what you view as what you would call like the power of bootstrapping, but also the limits of it, right? Like obviously people raise investor capital for a reason. So what do you view as the benefits and the drawbacks of bootstrapping, which is, a very tough thing. And I will note that I am married to an entrepreneur who started her own companies that she's bootstrapped, which are now very successful and profitable. And I joke that she has a business model where it's a weird motto. I don't think they teach this in business school anymore, but where their revenue exceeds their expenses, and there's probably a word for that. I don't know what you would call it.
Bootstrappers are better at that than VC-backed founders. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So bootstrapping is actually the most common path for entrepreneurs. You wouldn't know it from the attention that it gets, or I should say does not get in the media, but over 80% of the enterprises that exist were bootstrapped. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of enterprises, in the US, there are 31 million enterprises. 29 million of them are sole proprietorships, where people are, they might be coming and mowing your lawn or giving you some sort of, personal services, or they may be selling as a consultant, accounting services and the like. But so many, many companies are bootstrapped, and only about less than 1% of all of those 31 million have ever received venture funding at all. And the remainder are getting some sort of debt, right? People are taking loans. They don't have equity investors, but they are taking loans in order to move their businesses forward. So what does this mean? If you do not have pressure from investors, if you do not have to pay back your creditors, if you're in an industry that allows you to start with whatever you have and can provide, either you have some savings of your own that you're applying, or you're just starting to sell your services to build that up, you have a lot less pressure than someone who also has to satisfy the sources of their funding. And what that means is that after 5 years, a bootstrap business is 80% likely to still be in business compared to a funded business, which 50% is, I think, a generous estimate. Not bad for debt funding, but obviously for venture funding, you're going to see at best a 1 in 10 success rate, and most of those are not gigantic successes. So bootstrapping really, if you're in a space where you can do, I mean, some arenas just need too much money to ever bootstrap, right? If you're in commercial real estate, or if you're in pharmaceuticals, and of course, if you're trying to disrupt an entire market and have to acquire a gigantic set of customers, you have to take that funding. But there are many spaces where you don't, and we always counsel our students to go as long as they can without taking funding. To use the awards that you can get from the university where we don't take equity. Go as long as you can.
So let me press on that, Lori. If you were starting a company today and you had your choice between bootstrapping and you had an investor term sheet on the table, and let's say it was something that maybe you could bootstrap, but you thought it would take you a lot longer, would you bootstrap it? I realize that you're saying some companies, let's say you're in pharma, obviously if you're in biotech, you need money to do basic research that you're unlikely to have the capital to fund yourself. But if you were doing something that could be bootstrapped, but it would take longer, what would you advise?
I should tell you the story of the bootstrapper in my book, because the quote that we start with is basically, I could have taken a couple of million from investors, but I wanted to work on my own time and on my own space and keep the gains that I was able to create. So if you're in a space where you're selling services, you're building software and the like, you can probably go a pretty long way. And I mean, we're not in a time of easy money right now, but if you wound the clock back 4 years where every investor was throwing tons of money at people, there are a lot of people who took on term sheets that led them to have to move too quickly and can't really ever meet the projections that are needed in order to make their business profitable for the venture capitalist. So I would still say, if I could do it myself, I'd rather do that.
You would still bootstrap. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I know there are so many companies that are now in the position that you just discussed, Lori, which is that it's no longer 2021. It's very hard to get capital. There was money coming out of the sky back then.
Right.
And now, it's not just that you have to dig in the ground to get it, but it's way far out of reach, right? You're digging a deep, deep hole to get down to that source of capital. And so I think a lot more people are thinking about what businesses that they can bootstrap with, and maybe taking, small business loans or something else that would be something different for them than venture capital.
And there are, particularly in the social enterprise space, there are still a lot of places where people can get awards of different sorts and get support and grants and the like that aren't indebting them to not just loans, but actually to equity investors. So there are a variety of resources that are available.
What are some of those resources that you would suggest for somebody who wants to bootstrap their own company?
Well, just as an example, let's say the university, and let me tell you a little bit about what we do at Penn. We have, these are mostly for our students to begin with. We will offer them grants up to $50,000, start at $500, so they graduate upwards, which we do not take equity. They're non-dilutive grants and awards that are available. Now, obviously, everyone isn't in college and doesn't have access to those sorts of resources. In most communities, particularly if you're looking at community type problems, there are places like in Philadelphia, we have the Enterprise Center, which is also providing all sorts of advice and mentoring and sometimes office space, small grants, and the like. Our students at the university will also take on projects to help companies with, say, a go-to-market strategy or any sort of assessment. We create a variety of different sorts of projects, but our students will do consulting projects in essence. So there's that sort of support as well. And then, of course, there are larger competitions, right? Like the Holt competition, of course, is one of the big name brand ones. Only one person wins that each year, but those kinds of places are there. There's SoCal, there's Echoing Green. There's lots of foundations and fellowships that are plausible. But again, in the spirit of bootstrapping, you're starting small. You're looking to build out some solutions with your own labor and your own limited resources. And then you can start to acquire small grants, build from there.
Sure. So if somebody is reading your book, or even if somebody doesn't read your book, but they're still interested in starting their own company, Lori, what do you think is the main takeaway for them? Like, what's the main message that you want to get across to them?
You can do it and just get started. Instead of looking at these role models that exist out there and saying, this is so big and so gigantic, how can I ever get there? Look at what you've done and recognize that we are all innovative in our lives in one way or another. We may or may not be doing it at work, but we're probably thinking about our home life and our family and our routines and the like. And everybody's trying some different things. Find the ways that you've been innovative, celebrate them, and say, I can do a little bit more of this. This isn't that hard for me to do that. Just try some experiments. And if you fail in something that is self-funded and that you're just devoting some of your own time to doing it, there's no shame in that. And one of the things that people tend to point out in the U.S. across the East and West Coast is that the West Coast is more embracing of failure because they see it as a necessary part of getting to an effective solution, whereas the East Coast has maybe been a little more buttoned up in the past. But it's incredibly important.
As somebody who lived on the East Coast for most of my life and then moved to California, I can assure you what you said is definitely resonant with me. I've certainly noticed that. And it's funny, you talk about just starting and there's no shame in failing. I'll tell you, the shame that I see is in not trying, right? There's no shame in trying and not succeeding. The shame is in not trying at all. And a lot of the times people ask me about what they should read or what they should see in order to prepare themselves. And I always tell them, there may be books that are useful. There may be speeches. It might be inspirational or even informational for you. But, if somebody wants to learn how to play soccer, they don't read a book about it, right? They get on the field and they try their hand or their foot rather out, right? They go and they try and they practice and they see if they can get the hang of it. And I think the same is so with entrepreneurship, that you try it out. Like, there's very little that you can read to prepare yourself for what it is like to be the captain of a ship, even a small ship, which, the head with the crown is always the heaviest. But I appreciate what you're saying very much about just starting, because that seems to me to be the problem for some people who get stuck with the paralysis by analysis and trying to figure out all of these different variables and strategic plans. And I was thinking, you're a 6-month-old company and you're coming up with like a 3-year strategic plan. Like, you have no idea what the future holds. These business plans are not going to survive first contact with reality.
Right. We used to have what we called a business plan competition at the university for our student entrepreneurs. And now we call it the Startup Challenge, because all they do is a pitch deck. They don't come up with those incredibly detailed projections, which are a little bit imaginary. But importantly, we do have classes and majors in entrepreneurship and innovation. But to your point about you can't just teach it and have a framework and have that happen. You have to practice and have the experience. So coming up with concepts, ideating, and then coming over to our venture lab and incubating them and playing with these different ideas, getting the small exploratory grants to get a sense if there's any sort of market at all. This is part of the learning experience. And there are research studies that show that entrepreneurs who've done it before are better at doing it the next time, because you start to learn a set of procedures and steps that you ought to be following. And again, we can tell, it's not any different than parenting children. You can tell them, but they have to learn for themselves.
And also maybe similarly, the second time you do it, you might be more proficient than the first time. And actually in the book Super Founders, which we'll link in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com, they do also talk about what you just said, which is that somebody who has been an entrepreneur before, especially if they've succeeded, is far more likely to be successful in their second attempt and third attempt rather than people who are neophytes of this.
And some of that is because they're getting better at it. And some of that is because they have the network and are a known quantity to people who might want to support them with either funding or advice or mentorship or the like.
Yeah, going back to your 6 R's, that relationships are certainly one of them, and it's been very very useful. What you said earlier, Lori, reminded me you're talking about people who had some type of entrepreneurial endeavor when they were a kid that might have helped showcase or illustrate their personality. It reminded me of a time when I was 15 years old, and I had two entrepreneurial endeavors at the time. One, I was in a band, and we sold our album, and then two, I wrote a fanzine, like a music fanzine, and neither the band nor the zine were wildly popular. They had their own little following, but I was 15 years old and I was trying to build this own brand there. But there was a very popular band that was coming to town, and I videotaped it, which was totally illicit. It wasn't illegal. I videotaped it. And then I dubbed all of these VHS tapes of their show, like over 100 of them. And then I, at shows, would sell the videotape of a very popular band. And if you paid for it, you would get a free album of my band and a free zine. And the full cost was actually profitable. So if you had bought the zine or you had bought the album of my band, plus like the VHS, it was actually turning a profit on these. And so it was a fun way to package something that was less popular with something that was more popular to get people interested in it.
Yeah. And this experience serves you well over time. And it's like a mini example of recombination when I hear that. It's like you already knew how to do these other things, and now you just bundle it all together and you create something that's more valuable. What's incredible, Paul, is that students who are applying and coming in to our program as undergraduates, so these are our youngest students, age 18, how many of them are already building some sort of venture or endeavor because they've had community service requirements in high school, and they've started to push on a particular cause that they think is interesting, or anyone can kind of make an app these days. And with AI, it's getting even easier to brainstorm 100 different ideas in any particular domain and try to pursue that. So whether or not those are successful, it's just really the let's be innovative, let's try and do something, let's learn a lot along the way that we really celebrate.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of being innovative and speaking of lots of different ideas, what ideas, Lori, do you want to put out into the world that somebody else might want to take up? So if you think about, if somebody might be listening, they're thinking, okay, like I'm never going to go to Wharton. I may read Lori's book, but I want to do something impactful in the world. I don't know what it is. What company should this person think about starting? What problem should they think about tackling that you think is a good opportunity?
Well, I think there's tremendous opportunity in the broad space of elder care, right? The population is getting older. And, why do I think of this? I have parents who are in their 80s who live they call it independent living, where there's some help. They don't need tons of help yet, but you see the people who are in the next stage who need even more help. And it's very difficult for all those places to hire enough people because they tend to be low wage jobs in that sector. And so there's just so much opportunity to monitor and make sense of what's going on in the aging patient's life. There's medical sorts of issues, compliance with medication regimens. Are you getting up and moving and having your exercise? How about driving? My dad's still a pretty good driver, but again, there's just something that we want to be paying attention to. I think in Florida, they give them their licenses for 10 years, which is where my parents live. So they're far away. And I also worry about them because I'm up here in the Northeast. And of course, there's financial monitoring, right? People have usually created some sort of nest egg if they're fortunate. And yet it's very complicated how you manage things in an electronic age if you're already in your 80s or 90s. So we have some students who are working on great sorts of projects. The winner of our recent business plan competition is actually building out some solutions in this space. But I went to ChatGPT just in advance of this call to check. I said, give me 100 ideas for things in the elder care space. And some of them, I would smart medication dispenser, I would have thought of, but let me read you a couple of others here. Emergency buddy beacon, automatic bed repositioner, smart hydration reminder. So these may or may not be actual great ideas, right? Because AI just popped them all out. But AI is actually way better at coming up with 100 ideas quickly than you or I or even a group of 10 students or so.
I am very resigned to the fact that AI is dramatically superior to BI or to biological intelligence in many ways. Not always yet, but in many ways for sure.
Yeah, and I have one other idea I'd like to put out there, which is the mediation space. Again, I think AI gives us the potential to, at very low cost, help two opposing parties start to articulate what's really important to them in a negotiation and start to propose some compromises that might be good solutions. Typically, people get into disputes and hire attorneys and everything's contentious and you're ringing up a big bill. But really, much negotiation, and mediation is about finding the key issues for each party, which aren't always the same, and lots of assumptions are made. I think it just there's a lot of space. There are tools that exist out there, but I think there's some real opportunity in that space as well.
Well, before we adjourn, I'll tell you a very short story. So I know a retired judge who now serves as a mediator, and he told me that every case he mediates, while he still is coming up with his own judgments in them, that he inputs all of the filings into ChatGPT and asks ChatGPT to give him a ruling in favor of one side and to give him a ruling in favor of the other side. And then he reads both. And then he asks ChatGPT which one it thinks makes more legal sense. And he says that nearly, not always, but he said nearly 100% of the time he agrees with what ChatGPT has said. So, here you have a case where, the AI is not the mediator, but the mediator is utilizing ChatGPT and finding that it reasons in a way that he is in concert with. So it's pretty remarkable. It's pretty remarkable. So yeah, maybe we need like a chat judge or something.
Right. If it works well, you don't even have to go to the judge. Right. Two parties could just go to this at some point, very low cost, very quick sort of articulation and solution rather than a long, dragged out, emotionally draining process.
Yeah. Right. In the old days, you'd have to go to like King Solomon and have him propose cutting the baby in half. And, maybe Chat Judge will do a better job of this than even Solomon.
Exactly.
So, Lori, it's a really good book. I recommend it. Again, it's called Unstoppable Entrepreneurs, 7 Paths for Unleashing Successful Startups and Creating Value Through Innovation. Go check it out. It is now for sale. And Lori, we're wishing you great success with everything that you're doing. I hope the book rollout is fantastic and that you inspire many people to do something important in the world. And I hope that my own parents who are approaching 80 and also live in Florida may benefit from somebody starting a company with one of the elder care technologies that you're advising here. So if they ever have smart hydration, I'll know where this came from.
Absolutely. It's been great to be here, Paul. I've enjoyed speaking with you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.